Hello there, and welcome to Edge of Mind. Tonight, we are not going to the battles. We are not going to stand at the foot of any monument or trace the names of emperors across cold stone. We are going somewhere closer than that, somewhere smaller and warmer and far more ordinary. We are going to spend a day inside ancient Rome, not the Rome of history books, but the Rome that smelled of bread and fish sauce and warm stone in the afternoon sun. The Rome where people woke before the light came and moved through narrow streets pressed close against strangers, and gathered in the evening around food and wine and the kind of slow conversation that lasts well past the point where anyone meant to stay. It is a world that was loud and crowded, and richly, imperfectly human. And once you begin to feel your way into it, something shifts, because it is not as distant as it first appears. And before we go any further, I'd love to know where you are right now. What part of the world are you watching from tonight? Whether it's late where you are, or just getting quiet. Drop it in the comments. It's always so lovely to see where these evenings find people. Now, Rome. Before sunrise, the city was already moving. That is the first thing worth knowing. Rome did not ease into its days. It began them in the dim hours before full light, when the streets still carried the last of the night's traffic. Heavy wagons were only allowed through the city center after sundown, so the hours just before sunrise were still filled with their sound. The slow groan of wooden wheels across stone, the low voices of drivers, the occasional complaint of an animal finding its footing on uneven ground, all of it drifting through the narrow streets, between buildings that leaned close enough overhead to almost touch. Most Romans lived in buildings called insulae, tall, multi-story apartment structures that rose several floors above the streets below. The higher your floor, the less you paid, and the less you paid, the further you were from the ground, in an age when fire moved freely and water did not travel upward on its own. The higher floors were not comfortable places. They were small and warm in summer and difficult to heat in winter, and they held a particular kind of precariousness that most of their residents simply learned to live alongside. But in the dim hours before the sun arrived fully, those buildings were already stirring, doors opening, footsteps on stone stairs, the smell of something warming somewhere nearby. Breakfast, for most Romans, was a small and quiet thing. Bread, if there was any left from the day before. Olives, perhaps. Wine mixed with water, the wine so diluted it was closer to a flavored drink than anything else, something to ease the morning rather than mark it. Some people moved straight into the day on an empty stomach, knowing that the real meal was still many hours away. The morning was not a time for sitting, it was a time for beginning, for stepping out into the already moving city and finding your place inside it. The main meal, the cena, would not arrive until late afternoon or early evening. Everything before that was a kind of waiting, a slow building toward the moment when the day would finally gather itself around a table. But before any of that, there were the streets. Roman streets were narrow. Narrower than you might expect if your only image of Rome is the wide marble avenues of paintings and films. The ordinary streets of the city were close and dense and filled at almost all hours with the press of people moving through them, vendors calling out from doorways, animals being led from one place to another, children, workers, the simply curious, all of them finding their way through the same crowded passages. The smell was particular to that place and that time. Stone warmed by the sun, food cooking somewhere nearby, animals, people. The city had a scent that was entirely its own, layered and persistent, and not always pleasant, but alive in a way that is difficult to separate from the feeling of being inside it. The Roman day was measured differently than ours. Daylight was divided into 12 hours regardless of the season, which meant that a summer hour and a winter hour were not the same length at all. In summer, each hour stretched longer and slower. In winter, they narrowed and contracted. Time was not a fixed thing. It moved with the light, expanding and drawing inward across the year, in a way that made the day itself feel more like a living thing than a measurement. The first hours of the morning were for business, for moving through the city, attending to whatever the day required. The Forum, the great open center of Roman public life, was where much of this happened. Law and commerce, and politics and ordinary conversation, all gathered there in the same space, at the same time. A man might go to the Forum to settle a legal matter, and find himself, an hour later, simply standing and talking with someone he had not seen in several weeks. The Forum was not only a place of official business, it was a place where the city knew itself, where news moved, where arguments were made and gradually abandoned, where the texture of Roman life pressed together most visibly. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, the day would begin to slow. The midday hours carried a particular stillness. Shops closed, the press of activity softened, the sun reached its highest point, and the streets grew quieter, as though the city itself had agreed to pause for a while before the afternoon arrived, and everything gathered again. That pause, that long, warm, unhurried middle of the Roman day, is where we will go next. The midday pause had a particular quality to it, not silence, exactly. Rome was never truly silent, but a softening, a loosening of the morning's momentum. The vendors who had been calling since before the sun was fully up would grow quieter, and the legal arguments that had filled the Forum with their careful, insistent voices would settle into something more like murmuring. The city did not stop. It simply shifted its weight, the way a person does when they have been standing for a long while, and finally find somewhere to lean. For those who could, this was the time to withdraw, to move out of the heat and the press of the streets and into somewhere cooler and dimmer. The insulae, those tall, close-packed apartment buildings where most ordinary Romans spent their nights, were not always comfortable places to return to in the afternoon. The upper floors, where the cheapest rooms were, could be stifling in the warmth of those midday hours. But even there, in those narrow rooms above the noise, a person might lie down for a while and let the day drift past them without demanding anything in return. It was not so different in that way from the rhythm that still lives in warmer parts of the world. The quiet acknowledgement that the middle of the day belongs to rest, and that anything requiring effort is better saved for the hours when the light has begun to soften again. The thermopolia were never far away. These were small food counters built into the fronts of buildings all across the city. Stone counters with wide circular openings set into them, each one holding a vessel of something warm, lentils, perhaps, spiced wine, stews made from whatever was available and affordable that morning. A person with no kitchen at home, and many Romans had no kitchen at all, the fire risk in the insulae being simply too great, could find a warm meal at a thermopolium without traveling far or spending much. They would stand at the counter, or find a spot nearby, and eat slowly or quickly depending on how much of the afternoon still remained to them. The food itself was deeply seasoned. Garum appeared in nearly everything. That fermented fish sauce that Romans used the way a later world might use salt, or a richer, more layered version of it. It was salty and savory, and full of a depth that is difficult to describe without tasting it. Bread was common, olives, eggs, chickpeas cooked until they were soft and warm. The flavors of an ordinary Roman meal were strong and woven through with ingredients that had been preserved and fermented and dried, because that was how food lasted in a world without cold storage. And then, gradually, the afternoon would begin to move again. The baths came alive in the later hours of the day. The thermae, those vast public bathing complexes that the city offered to almost anyone who could pay a small fee, which was nearly everyone, were not simply places to wash. They were among the most social spaces in all of Rome. A person might spend several hours there, moving through different rooms at different temperatures, from the warm room to the hot room, and then out again into the cooler air, talking all the while. Friends met there. Strangers became acquaintances. Business was discussed in the steam the same way it might have been discussed in the Forum that morning, but with less formality and more ease. The architecture of the great baths was generous and deliberate. High vaulted ceilings, light falling through windows set near the tops of the walls, the sound of water and voices, and the particular echo that large warm stone spaces carry. It was not a hurried place. The baths rewarded staying, and most people did. Oils were used instead of soap, rubbed into the skin, and then slowly scraped away with a small curved tool called a strigil. Attendants were available for those who could afford them. Others managed on their own, or with the help of whoever they had come with. The whole process was slow and deliberate and social in a way that washing, in most later periods of history, simply was not. By the time a person emerged from the baths, the light would have shifted, the afternoon would be leaning toward evening, the shadows in the streets would have grown longer and softer, and the quality of the air would have changed in that particular way. It does when the heat of the day has finally begun to release its hold. This was when the cena began to gather itself. Not a single moment, but a slow arrival. The movement of people toward wherever the evening meal would be. For those fortunate enough to be invited to a proper dinner, this meant making their way to a friend's home, or a patron's, or somewhere that a table had been arranged, and food was already being prepared. For others, it meant returning to the thermopolium, or finding what could be assembled in a small room with very little by way of equipment. But the cena, whatever form it took, was not simply about eating. It was the social and emotional center of the Roman day, the place where the hours of movement and noise finally resolved into something slower and more deliberate. Wine was mixed with water, because drinking it undiluted was considered the habit of someone who had lost their sense of proportion. Courses arrived gradually. Conversation moved at its own pace, wandering into philosophy or gossip or memory without any particular urgency. The evening was long, and the Romans were in no hurry to end it. Outside, as the lamps came on and the voices around the table grew warmer, the city was beginning its own nighttime transformation. A different kind of life stirring in the streets, one that belonged entirely to the hours after the sun had gone. The lamps that came on in the evening were small things. Oil lamps, most of them, burning with a flame no larger than a thumbnail. They gave off a warm, unsteady light that moved slightly in any current of air, and they carried the scent of whatever oil fed them, usually olive oil. Though other varieties had their own particular character, a room lit by several of them together held a quality of warmth that was almost amber, the kind of light that softens the edges of everything and makes the people gathered inside it seem closer than they might in the full, even light of day. This was the light of the cena, the evening meal. Not the broad, open light of the forum at midday, but something gathered and close, pooling around the table and leaving the rest of the room in a gentle dimness. The couches were arranged around a low central table. For those who followed Roman dining tradition reclined to eat, rather than sitting upright. The food came in courses, carried in by household slaves if the host had them, or assembled more simply in households where the evening meal was a quieter affair. Either way, the rhythm was the same, unhurried, gradual, shaped by conversation as much as by hunger. The wine at a Roman table was almost never served as it came from the vessel. It was mixed with water, sometimes warm, sometimes cool, depending on the season and the preference of whoever was hosting. The ratio mattered, and people had opinions about it. Too much wine to water, and the evening could slip away from itself. Too much water, and the wine lost what made it worth drinking. The mixing was a small ritual, and like many small rituals, it carried meaning well beyond its practical purpose. To drink wine without water was associated with a kind of excess that the Roman sensibility, at least in its more measured moments, found troubling. There was a word for the loss of proportion that came from drinking without care, and it was not a word anyone wanted applied to their table. The mixing bowl, then, was not merely a vessel. It was a quiet statement about the kind of evening the host intended to offer. Food at a proper cena moved through several stages. There were the gustatio, the opening dishes, lighter things meant to open the appetite rather than satisfy it. Eggs were common here, and olives, and small preparations of vegetables or preserved fish. Then came the main courses, more substantial, and finally the mensa secunda, the second table which brought sweeter things, fruit, honey, nuts, sometimes small cakes. Garum appeared at almost every stage, worked into sauces and dressings, lending that deep, salt-rich quality that Roman cooking returned to again and again. But the food, as central as it was, existed within something larger. The cena was also where ideas moved. Philosophers were sometimes invited to speak. Poets read their work, or had it read aloud. Arguments unfolded slowly, and were not always resolved. Someone might offer a passage from memory, Homer, or Virgil, or something more obscure, and the table would sit with it for a while before the conversation found its way somewhere else. There was a tradition the Romans called the convivium, the shared life of the table, and they took it seriously as a form of civilization. To eat well with others was not indulgence. It was, in their understanding, one of the things that made a life worth living. The evening meal was not something to be finished and moved past. It was something to remain inside of, for as long as the lamps and the company allowed. Not every Roman had access to this kind of evening. For many, the cena was simpler, bread and whatever could be purchased from the thermopolium on the way home, eaten in a small room on an upper floor of an insula. The insula were not quiet places. Even at night, neighbors were close, and sounds traveled easily through the walls. The smell of other people's cooking, or the absence of it, was part of the texture of ordinary life in those buildings. A family might gather around a small oil lamp of their own, eating from a shared vessel, the children already growing heavy with the end of the day. Outside all of this, the city continued. The carts that had been absent during the daylight hours were now moving through the streets, heavy wagons carrying supplies, construction materials, goods that needed to reach their destinations before morning. The sound of iron-rimmed wheels on stone was one of the characteristic sounds of the Roman night, along with the voices of those who worked after the sun had gone, and the occasional disturbance that any large city generates when a portion of its population is awake and moving without the structure that daylight imposes. Some Romans found the night difficult to sleep through. The noise was real and persistent. The upper floors of the insulae, where the poorest residents lived, were also the most exposed to sound, to cold in winter, to heat in summer. A lamp left burning in a crowded building of wood and plaster was a risk that everyone understood. The vigils, a combined fire watch and night patrol, moved through the city after the sun went down, but fires still happened with a regularity that shaped how people thought about where they lived and what they kept close to them. And yet the night also had its own particular ease. The heat of the day was gone. The press of the forum crowds had dissolved. Whatever the evening had held, the warmth of the baths, the long, slow gathering of the cena, the voices of friends growing quieter as the lamps burned lower, all of it settled gradually into something approaching stillness. Not silence, because Rome was rarely silent, but a softer quality of sound, more distant, as the city found its way through the dim hours toward the one that would come before sunrise, when the whole long cycle would begin again, the bread warming, the streets filling, and another ordinary day opening itself slowly into the light. The night in Rome was never truly empty. It had its own population, its own rhythms and reasons. And if you were someone who lay awake on one of those upper floors listening, you would have heard the city rearranging itself in the absence of daylight, not winding down so much as shifting into something else, a different version of the same restless, living thing. There is something worth staying with in that image. The same streets that had been full of vendors and voices, and the smell of frying onions from a thermopolium, were now carrying a different kind of life. The carts were moving. Deliveries were being made. Somewhere in the city, a baker had already begun. Roman bakers worked through the night as a matter of necessity. Bread needed time to rise, time to bake, and the loaves that would appear in the early morning had been in preparation for hours before anyone else was stirring. The ovens were wood-fired and ran warm through the long, dim stretch of night. The smell of baking bread was one of the first things that would have reached a Roman waking slowly in the grey time before full light, not an announcement, just a gradual arrival, warmth and grain and something familiar drifting in through a window or a gap in the plaster wall. Bread was not a luxury in Rome. It was the center of the ordinary diet, present at almost every meal in some form. The city's supply of it was taken seriously enough that the distribution of grain to citizens had long been a matter of public concern. The bakers who supplied the city were numerous and organized, their trade one of the most essential in any Roman neighborhood. A good bakery was a landmark, a place people knew by smell as much as by sight. The morning that followed the night had its own particular quality. The carts were still finishing their last runs. The streets were not yet full, and there was a brief, narrow window of relative quiet, not stillness, but something close to it, before the city gathered itself back into the full press of the waking day. Street sweepers moved through some of the wider roads. Water was drawn from the public fountains, which ran continuously, fed by the long stone channels of the aqueducts. The aqueducts are worth staying with for a moment. Rome had several of them by the height of the empire, each one a long, patient structure, carrying water across considerable distances, over hills and across valleys, supported on rows of arches where the land dipped low. The water arrived into the city at a steady flow. From there it moved through a system of pipes and basins, reaching the public fountains, the baths, and the homes of those wealthy enough to have a private connection. For most Romans, the public fountain was where water came from. a short walk away, always running, always available. The sound of water in Rome was constant and unremarkable, which is perhaps the truest sign of how deeply it had been woven into ordinary life. People gathered at the fountains in the early morning. It was a practical stop, and a social one. News moved through these small gatherings: who had arrived, what had happened in the night, what the day ahead was likely to bring. The forum would carry the larger conversations, the debates and the legal proceedings and the commerce that shaped Roman public life. But the fountain was where the morning began for many people, in a smaller and more immediate way. The light was growing by now. The 12 hours of the Roman day were beginning their slow unfurling, longer in summer, narrower in winter, but always 12, always carrying the same names regardless of what the sun was doing. The first hour was the hour of beginnings. Shops were opening. School children were already on their way, some accompanied, some moving through familiar streets on their own. Teachers often held their lessons in outdoor spaces, under a portico, in a corner of a public area, and the sound of recitation, children repeating lines of poetry or passages of law in a steady murmur, was a recognizable part of the early morning in certain neighborhoods. The Roman school day began early and ended well before midday. The heat of late morning made sustained concentration difficult, and the midday rest that shaped the Roman day meant that most structured activity had to be completed in the first half of the daylight hours. Children learned to read and write, to count, and in the more advanced schools, to speak well. Rhetoric was considered one of the most valuable skills a Roman could develop: the ability to argue clearly, to persuade, to hold a room with words. It was not simply an academic exercise, it was the foundation of public life. And public life was always close in Rome. The city was dense in a way that is difficult to fully imagine. Hundreds of thousands of people living within a relatively small area, the streets narrow, the buildings tall, the spaces between them filled with sound and smell, and the continuous low murmur of human activity. Privacy was rare, and not especially prized. The Roman sense of what was public and what was private was arranged differently from the one that came later. The street was an extension of daily life, not a separation from it. People ate at the thermopolia, argued in the forum, bathed together in the great warm rooms of the thermae, and generally conducted the business of living in full view of one another. There was a particular ease in that closeness, even alongside its difficulties. The city held you, it pressed in, and in pressing in, it also kept you company. A constant, imperfect, richly human company that followed you from the fountain in the morning to the lamplit table in the evening. The midday hours were approaching now, and with them, a shift in the quality of the day, a slowing, a settling, a withdrawal from the heat and noise into something quieter and more interior. The heat came gradually, the way it always did in Rome, not as a single moment, but as a slow gathering of warmth that moved through the stone and the plaster and the narrow air between buildings until the whole city felt like something that had been left too long in the sun. The shadows that had stretched long and cool across the cobblestones in the early morning had shortened and thinned. The light that fell now into the streets was full and flat and heavy with summer. Shops that had been open since before sunrise began to draw their awnings or close their shutters part way. The vendors who had been calling out since the first hour grew quieter. The pace of the street changed, not stopping, never fully stopping in a city like Rome, but easing, the way a river eases when it reaches a wider, shallower place and spreads itself out without urgency. This was the midday, and Romans understood it as its own kind of time. Not wasted time, not empty time, but a different quality of time, softer and more interior than the busy morning hours. Those who could withdraw from the heat. A shopkeeper might sit in the dim back of his stall rather than the bright front of it. A craftsman might set down his tools and rest his eyes for a while, his hands still and open in his lap. Children had already been released from their lessons. The streets nearest the schools, which had been murmuring with recitation since early morning, had grown quiet again. That murmuring, so steady and so ordinary just a few hours before, had simply faded, the way sound fades when a room gradually empties and no one marks the moment it goes. The insulae, those tall and layered apartment buildings that held most of the city's population, were never truly silent. Someone was always moving on the stairs, always speaking through a wall, always setting something down on a floor that was someone else's ceiling. But even they took on a different quality in the middle of the day, a stillness that settled into them, not complete, but present, the kind of stillness that exists within noise rather than instead of it. For those with the means and the inclination, the midday hours were often when the thermae began to fill in earnest. The public baths were open for much of the day, and the midday crowd had a particular character, less hurried than the morning, more leisurely than the late afternoon, when the baths would grow louder and more social. A person arriving now might find a certain ease in the warm rooms, the air full with steam, the sound of water moving steadily through channels and basins that had been carrying it since long before the city woke. The thermae were not simply places to wash, they were where a Roman might spend an hour or two without any particular purpose at all, moving from the cooler outer rooms to the warmer ones, resting on a stone bench, exchanging a few words with someone nearby. There were rooms for movement, open courtyards where light fell in long columns through high windows, and smaller chambers where the heat was dry and still. Attendants moved through the spaces offering oil for the skin, which was applied before bathing, and then slowly scraped away along with the day's dust and warmth. The instrument used for that scraping was called a strigil, a narrow, curved length of metal that moved across the skin in long, deliberate strokes. It was a slow process, unhurried by nature, as much about sensation as cleanliness. Soap was used occasionally, but oil and the strigil were the more common method, and a person submitting to it might find the whole thing quietly meditative, the warmth of the room, the steady movement, the gradual feeling of the day being lifted away. The water itself arrived through the aqueducts, those long stone channels that carried it from sources far outside the city, and delivered it with a steadiness that Romans came to regard as simply part of how the world worked. The water was always there. It moved through the city in pipes and fountains, and the great heated pools of the baths, and it left again through drains that carried it away beneath the streets. Most Romans did not pause to consider it. The water simply came, the way morning came, the way the smell of bread came from the bakeries before sunrise. The texture of ordinary life, unremarkable precisely because it was so reliably present. Outside, in the streets that had quieted somewhat but never fully emptied, the thermopolia continued their work. These small counters were built into the fronts of buildings, their wide stone surfaces set with deep circular openings that held heated vessels throughout the day. A person with a few coins might stop and eat standing at the counter, a bowl of something warm and thick, flavored with garum, that deep and savory note running beneath the taste of lentils or chickpeas or whatever the day's preparation happened to be. It was not a refined meal, it was sustenance, eaten without ceremony, the way most Romans ate most of their meals, standing in the street with the city moving around them. The cena, the great meal of the evening, was still hours away. It existed somewhere at the far end of the afternoon as a kind of promise, the long, unhurried gathering that would eventually bring the day to its fullest and most human expression. But that was later. For now, the city rested in its midday warmth, doing what it always did in the slow middle hours, continuing, quietly, without announcement, in the particular way that very large and very old things continue when no one is especially watching. The afternoon would come in its own time, and with it, the city would begin to stir again. The baths growing louder, the forum filling once more, the long shadows of late day beginning their slow return across the stones. The afternoon settled over the city, the way warmth settles into stone, gradually, without announcement, until it had simply become the quality of everything. The long middle hours had softened the pace of the streets, and now, as the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, something shifted in the air, not loudly, not all at once, but the city, which had never entirely stilled, began to find its second rhythm, the one that belonged to the later hours, to the slow gathering of people moving toward the parts of the day they had been saving. Shops that had folded their shutters against the midday heat began to open again, their wooden panels swinging wide to let in the cooler air. Voices returned to the streets in greater numbers. The forum, which had grown quieter in the slow hours, began to fill once more, not with the dense morning press of bodies and business, but with something more leisurely, more conversational. People moved without the urgency that had carried them through the earlier hours. The day had already done most of what it needed to do, and what remained felt more like choosing than hurrying. The shadows had grown long and particular by this point, falling at angles that made familiar streets look briefly unfamiliar. In the insulae, the tall apartment buildings that housed the great majority of the city's people, the upper floors caught the last of the direct light, while the narrow lanes below had already moved into something dimmer and cooler. Those who lived on the higher floors might sit near their windows in the late afternoon and feel the air beginning to change, the warmth of the day softening at its edges, without quite releasing yet. It was in these hours that the baths reached their fullest life. The morning visitors had come and gone, and the midday quiet had passed, and now the therma filled with a different kind of crowd, people who had finished their work for the day, or who had arranged their hours around this particular pleasure. The rooms were warm and full of voices. The sound of water moved beneath everything else, a steady and unhurried note beneath the conversation, and the occasional laughter that drifted between the chambers. There were attendants in the baths who offered services for a small additional coin. One of these was a scraping of oil from the skin, done with a curved tool called a strigil, the Roman way of washing in an age before soap was widely used. The oil was worked slowly into the skin, and then drawn away along with whatever the day had left behind. The process was deliberate and unhurried, not unlike the bath itself in its feeling, a gradual removal, a slow returning to something cleaner and quieter beneath the surface. Some Romans spent a long time in the baths, and there was no particular reason to leave. The rooms moved from warm to warmer to very warm, and a person might pass through them in whatever order suited them, pausing in the cooler plunge pool when the heat had built to a certain fullness, then returning again to the warmth. Conversation happened easily in these spaces. Friendships were maintained across the low stone edges of pools, in the particular ease that comes from being warm and unhurried, and surrounded by the steady sound of water. Outside, the light was shifting. The Roman way of measuring the hours meant that the afternoon hours of summer were long and generous, each one stretching further than its winter equivalent. A person moving through the city in the late afternoon of a warm season had more time than they might have expected. The day gave itself slowly, and the evening arrived without rushing. The cena was the meal that the whole day had been quietly moving toward, in households where it was observed with any care at all, and this ranged from the modest to the elaborate, depending on what a family had and who they wished to share it with. The table was the center of everything. Guests arrived in the early evening, and the gathering was never meant to be brief. Courses came in a particular order, beginning with lighter things, eggs, vegetables, small savory preparations, before moving toward the heavier dishes at the meal's center, and then eventually toward the sweeter things that signaled the closing of the table. Wine was present throughout, always mixed with water in proportions that varied by preference and occasion. To drink wine unmixed was considered something worth remarking on, a sign of excess, or of a particular disregard for the ordinary customs of the table. The mixing was social as much as practical, a way of extending the evening without losing the thread of conversation that was in many ways the real purpose of the gathering. Garum appeared in the cooking in ways that a guest might not always notice, worked into sauces, added to preparations that needed depth, present as a background note rather than a flavor that announced itself. It deepened whatever it touched. The Romans used it the way a painter uses shadow, not to create contrast but to give the whole composition a richer ground to rest against. The dining room, the triclinium, in households that had one, was arranged so that guests reclined on low couches around the table rather than sitting upright. This posture was simply the way the evening was shaped. Reclining suggested ease. It suggested that the meal was not a brief interruption but an arrival, a place the day had been moving toward, and where it would be allowed to rest. But the evening was still young. The candles had been lit, and the room held their warmth against the growing cool of the night outside. Somewhere beyond the walls of the house, the city was beginning its own transformation, the one that happened after the sun had finally gone, when the streets took on a different character entirely. The candles were not bright. That is worth staying with for a moment, the particular quality of light that filled a Roman dining room in the evening, which was nothing like the steady, even glow that fills a room today. It was warmer and more uneven, and it moved. The flames shifted with the breath of conversation, with the slow passage of a servant between the couches, with the faint movement of air that found its way through doorways and curtains. The shadows in the corners were full and soft, and the faces of the people gathered around the table were lit from below and from the side, the way faces look when the light is close, and human rather than distant and fixed. This was the texture of the evening from within, not something out of a painting, with its suggestion of gold and stillness, simply warm and close, and gently unsteady, the kind of light that makes a room feel smaller than it is, in the way that feels like comfort rather than confinement. The conversation at the table moved without any particular destination. This was one of the qualities that the Romans valued in a long evening meal. Not that it arrived somewhere, but that it wandered. Philosophy might appear, and then dissolve into something more personal. A piece of news from the forum, half remembered and softened in the retelling, might drift into a story about someone's cousin, or a dispute about wine, or a memory that one of the guests had not thought about in years, and could not explain why it had surfaced now. The best evenings were the ones where no one could quite account for how so much time had passed. There were readings. Sometimes, a household that had access to a reader, someone who could hold a scroll and deliver its contents aloud while the others reclined and listened, might offer this as part of the evening's texture. Poetry was common, so were passages from history, or letters, or the work of philosophers, whose names were familiar enough to carry weight without needing much introduction. The reading was not a performance, exactly. It was more like another voice joining the gathering, one that arrived from somewhere else, and added a different kind of warmth to the room. Music was present in some households as well, not as entertainment in the way that word tends to suggest, but as something that ran beneath the evening the way a quiet current runs beneath the surface of water that appears still from above. A single instrument played without urgency, in a room where people were already inclined toward ease. The sound did not ask for attention, it simply accompanied whatever else was happening, filling the spaces between sentences, the way candlelight filled the spaces between faces. Children, in households where they were present, sometimes appeared at the edges of the evening before being guided away toward sleep. Their presence at the table was not unusual in less formal gatherings. The Roman household was not a place where the generations were kept carefully separate, and a child sitting near a parent while adults talked around them was simply part of the way an evening could be shaped. The sounds of the house continued around the meal, something being washed, something being set down, the particular quiet of a building settling into the later hours. Outside, the city had changed. The carts that had been barred from the streets during daylight were now moving freely, heavy vehicles carrying stone and timber and grain, through the narrow passages between buildings. The sound of wheels on stone carried a long way in the dim, and the voices of the drivers and their assistants rose and fell without the same restraint that the daylight hours seemed to encourage. Rome at night was not a quieter city. It was a different one, louder in some ways, and stranger, and filled with a different set of people going about a different set of purposes. The Insulo rose above all of it. These were the tall, multi-story buildings where much of the city's population lived, and the upper floors, where the more modest rooms were, sat close to the noise and the smell of the streets below. Their windows remained open to whatever the night brought in. The people who lived on those floors had a different relationship with the city's nighttime sounds than those who slept in the quieter rooms of a ground-level house. They were inside the noise rather than sheltered from it, and they learned, as people do, to sleep within what they could not change. Fires were a concern that never entirely left the mind of someone living in an insula. Cooking was done with open flames in rooms that were close together and built from materials that offered little resistance to heat. The city had organized watchmen, the vigils who moved through the streets at night with this particular danger in their attention. Still, the anxiety was a reasonable one, and the people who lived in the upper rooms carried it quietly alongside everything else. Down at street level, the thermopolia, the small counters where hot food had been served to the midday crowd, had long since closed and gone still. But other kinds of commerce continued in the spaces between buildings. Sellers and traders, whose work was shaped by the hours when the city's official attention was elsewhere, moved through the narrow streets with their own unhurried purposes. The streets were never entirely empty. They simply held different people and different purposes, and a different quality of sound that anyone who had spent enough time in the city would have recognized without needing to name. The gathering inside the dining room continued, unhurried. While all of this moved around it, the evening had not yet reached its end, and no one at the table seemed inclined to be the first to suggest that it had. The wine was still being mixed, The candles had burned lower, but had not gone out, and the conversation had found one of those long, unhurried passages that sometimes open up in the middle of a good evening, when no one needs to say anything in particular, and the room itself seems content simply to hold the people inside it for a little while longer. The candles had burned to a different length now. The room was the same room, and the people were the same people, but something had shifted in the way the evening held itself. Softer, slower, the way a long conversation settles into its final passages, without anyone quite deciding that it has. A Roman evening of this kind did not end with any particular signal. There was no moment when the host rose, and the guests understood it was time to go. Instead, the cena unwound gradually, the way a long piece of cloth unrolls when you set one end free and let it find its own pace. The wine had been mixed many times over. The food had moved through its courses and arrived at the sweet things: honeyed nuts, dried figs, small cakes made with poppy seeds, and those too had been eaten slowly, with the same unhurried attention that had been given to everything else. A Roman meal of any warmth or standing was not a thing to be finished. It was a thing to be lived inside for as long as the evening allowed. There was no hurry toward the end of it. The end simply arrived, the way evening arrives, not announced, but present and gentle when it came. The conversation at a cena of this kind might have moved through many rooms, in a manner of speaking. Philosophy was not unusual. Neither was gossip, or the retelling of something that had happened in the forum earlier in the day, or a piece of verse that someone had been carrying in their memory and wanted to release into the room. Something about the warmth of the room and the slowness of the food seemed to change the way words arrived, softer than they might have been elsewhere, and more willing to linger. Romans of a certain standing placed a high value on the spoken word, on the ability to say a thing well, to hold the attention of a table, and offer something worth hearing. But even among those who placed no particular value on eloquence, the table was a place where speaking and listening happened in a different register than they did in the street. Slaves moved quietly in the background of all of this. They refilled the cups, removed the dishes, brought the next course when it was time. Their presence was woven so completely into the fabric of Roman domestic life that it was rarely remarked upon. They were part of the household in the way that the walls were part of the household, present, necessary, and largely unspoken about in any document that has survived. What they thought of the evenings they moved through, what they heard and remembered and carried home to their own rest, is something the record does not offer. Only the outline of their work remains, visible in the shape of the evening itself. Outside, the city had not stilled. The carts that had been absent all day were now fully present, their wheels finding the worn grooves in the stone streets, their drivers calling to one another across the narrow gaps between buildings. Rome at night was its own version of Rome, louder in some ways than the city of the afternoon, and stranger, and belonging to a different set of people. The lamplighters had been out since dusk, but their work only softened the dimness rather than removing it. The streets between the pools of light were genuinely dim, and the sounds that came from them were not always easy to place. A city of 1 million people does not grow still simply because the sun has gone down. It simply changes its voice. The noise shifts, the people change, and the night moves on in its own way, unhurried and indifferent to the hour. By the time the guests of a long cena finally rose and made their way toward the door, the night would have been well advanced. Farewells in Rome were not brief. They happened in stages, at the table, then in the atrium, then at the threshold of the house, where the conversation might continue for a while longer before the final parting. And then the guests would step out into the street and become part of the nighttime city themselves, finding their way home through the noise and the dim light and the smell of the night air, which in Rome carried everything the day had left behind. The person who finally lay down to sleep would have moved through a day of considerable density. Not the kind that belongs to battles or proclamations, but the ordinary density of a life lived in close proximity to many other lives. The smell of bread from a neighbor's fire in the early morning. The sound of the street coming alive before the sun had fully risen. The press of the forum, where news and argument and commerce all occupied the same narrow space. Then the ease of the baths, where the warm water asked nothing of you, and the afternoon opened briefly into something unhurried. And then the long, slow gathering of the cena, where food and wine and conversation moved together toward no particular destination except the quiet end of the day, each part of it distinct and each part of it woven into the next, the way 1 hour folds softly into another without any clear line between them. This was what it felt like to be alive in Rome, not in the marble version of the city, not in the version that has come down through monuments and histories and the careful preservation of exceptional things, but in the version that was actually inhabited, loud and warm and close, smelling of bread and fish sauce, and the particular sharpness of a city that never entirely emptied itself of people, a world that was imperfect and crowded and ordinary in the most human sense of the word, and in being all of those things, was also full. The day has ended now, for them as for you. The candles have burned down, the streets have grown quieter, or at least quieter in their own way, and somewhere in the long distance between that world and this one, the shape of an ordinary day remains, not preserved in stone, but in the simple fact that people have always needed to eat and rest and sit with one another in the warmth of an evening that is in no hurry to end. Thank you for being here tonight. Good night.